For 7 consecutive weeks, the silver minivan occupied the same neglected corner of the McDonald's parking lot. Huddled under the reach of a flickering security light, it was a silent, stationary fixture that belonged to neither the late shift crew nor the midnight drifters. The windows were entirely opaque, clouded over from the inside by the moisture of 4 distinct, heavy breaths trapped within a shrinking, metal world. A makeshift curtain, fashioned from a heavy wool blanket and held in place by a single, rusted safety pin, ensured that the interior remained a private, impenetrable fortress against the harsh reality of the outside world. Harrison Whitfield, a man whose 78 years were worn with a sharp, disciplined, and often cold grace, sat in his vintage sedan 6 spaces away, the engine long silenced. He had been coming here for 3 nights. Drawn by a gravity he could neither name nor resist, he did not know the identities of those inside. Nor could he articulate why his nocturnal wanderings, once meant to soothe his restless spirit after decades of corporate warfare, now felt tethered to this specific, desolate spot. Harrison had spent the better part of a lifetime perfecting the art of keeping his mind in motion. A survival habit forged in the crucible of his own penniless adolescence when a beat-up 1996 Honda Civic had served as his primary bedroom, with black garbage bags stuffed in the trunk to hold the few remnants of a life he was desperate to leave behind. He understood the psychology of the road, the way the city felt safer when viewed through a moving windshield. As if the speed of his tires could stave off the specter of instability that still haunted the periphery of his dreams. From his vantage point, he watched the van with a clinical, yet unexpectedly heavy heart. It wasn't parked haphazardly. The position was deliberate, nestled carefully within the sightline of the drive-through security camera. A silent, desperate plea for the watchful eye of a machine when human eyes had failed them. He sipped lukewarm coffee, his eyes fixed on his side mirror, tracking the condensation that bloomed across the van's glass like a map of human desperation. It was a suffocating sight, the realization that an entire family's existence had been distilled into a small, steel box. He felt the cold iron of the steering wheel beneath his palms, a tactile reminder of the distance he had traveled from that life. Yet the air in his car felt suddenly thin, as if he were suffocating alongside them. Then, the moment shifted with a startling, quiet violence. A small, pale hand appeared on the inside of the passenger window. A child's hand, pressed flat against the cold glass and dragged downward, carving a narrow, vertical trench through the thick, gray fog of breath. For a heartbeat, a pair of eyes, small, curious, and profoundly, achingly human, peered through the gap, surveying the dark expanse of the lot with an innocence that seemed too fragile for the concrete world. The child was looking through that narrow gap into the vast, dark expanse of the lot, searching for something that wasn't there. Then, the hand withdrew, and the moisture rushed back to seal the void, erasing the connection as quickly as it had been made. Later, in the pristine, temperature-controlled silence of his penthouse, where every surface was clean and the world was seen through floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic view of Charlotte's rising ambition, Harrison found no peace. He stood by the window, staring out toward the dark, flat sprawl of the city. The image of that hand on the glass stayed with him not as a memory, but as a physical weight. The way something now pressed against the inside of his chest with an ache that felt like a long-forgotten wound reopening. He had built his company to be a bulwark against the kind of poverty he had escaped, promising himself that he would create stability where he had found none. Yet, the weight in his chest suggested he had failed in ways he hadn't yet begun to calculate. He was a titan of industry, a man who had moved mountains of earth to construct towers of glass. Yet here he was, pacing his own marble floors, haunted by the ghost of a child's hand against a fogged window. Sleep eluded him, but for the first time in years. It was not because of the mounting pressure of business deals or the volatility of the stock market. It was because he knew he would return to that parking lot. The realization settled into his bones with the weight of a final judgment. He had to know who they were. And more importantly, he had to know why they were there. Because the secret they held was one he suspected he had helped write. He turned away from the panoramic view of the city he owned, realizing that the view meant nothing if he couldn't see the people living in the shadows of his own success. He had to go back. The following night, the air in Charlotte hung heavy and stagnant, a thick blanket of humidity that made the city feel like a closed room, devoid of breath or movement. Harrison returned to his usual vigil, but this time, the cold indifference he usually wore like a protective suit of armor was replaced by a restless, gnawing curiosity. He watched the silver minivan from his darkened sedan, the engine long dead, waiting for the subtle shifts in movement that would signify the start of the family's evening ritual. He was no longer just a man driving to escape his own thoughts. He was a student of a struggle he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. He noticed that the woman, the mother, Naomi Jackson, moved with a quiet, efficient, and hauntingly practiced urgency. There was no wasted motion, no luxury of hesitation. She would exit the driver's seat, check the perimeter of the lot with a glance that was both cautious and exhausted, and then slide the side door open with a practiced flick of her wrist. He watched as she began the transformation of the cramped interior. Pillows were fluffed and arranged against the doors. School bags were organized into neat, orderly piles, and a small, collapsible plastic table was set up between the seats. It was a chore performed with the kind of dignity that made the surrounding, grimy reality of the parking lot seem like an insult to her efforts. Harrison's thoughts drifted uncontrollably to his own corporate offices, specifically the cavernous headquarters of the Whitfield Development Group that loomed over the city center. He thought of the polished mahogany boardrooms, the chilled air-conditioned luxury, and the relentless, bloodless drive for expansion that had defined his career for the last 40 years. He had always taken pride in the idea that he was building homes for people, providing the foundation for the American dream, a legacy of concrete and steel. But as he watched the mother pull a small, homemade dinner from a battered cooler, plating it carefully on disposable napkins as if to suggest that their location was merely a temporary detail and not a destination, a cold, sickening realization began to take root in his stomach. He needed to know their story. He could no longer observe them as silhouettes in the dark, as abstract figures in a landscape of his own making. Harrison waited until the lights inside the minivan dimmed and the children's silhouettes became still, signaling that they had finally settled for the night. He then stepped out of his sedan, his movements stiff, his joints protesting the long hours of inactivity. He walked toward the Waffle House, his shadow stretching long and distorted under the flickering, buzzing security lamps. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle, rhythmic clinking of silverware from the kitchen. Silas, the night manager he had spoken to in passing the night before, was leaning against the counter, cleaning a coffee pot with a stained rag. He didn't look surprised to see Harrison return. In fact, there was a knowing, weary resignation in his eyes. "You're back," Silas said, his voice low, lacking any trace of surprise. "I am," Harrison replied, his gaze drifting back out to the window where the minivan sat like a somber tombstone in the dark. "That woman. How long have they been doing this? How long has she been trying to raise a family in a parking lot?" Quote, Silas sighed, a sound that seemed to pull the very air out of the room. He scrubbed a spot on the counter that was already clean. His movements mechanical. Naomi. That's her name. She's been here for 2 months. She's a certified nursing assistant. Works the overnight shift at the medical center downtown. Then picks them up and brings them here to sleep. Before she lost it, she had a nice, quiet place over at Green Oaks. A good, solid apartment complex where the rent was actually reasonable. Harrison felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him feeling cold despite the humid night. Green Oaks? I know that name. I know the project. Yeah, you probably do, Silas muttered, finally looking Harrison directly in the eye with a gaze that held no malice, only the crushing weight of truth. It's one of the properties your company bought up. They tore the heart out of it for some luxury revitalization project. They jacked the rent up so high. The folks who actually lived there didn't stand a chance. Families who had been there for a decade were out on the street in weeks. Naomi fought it, tried to get them to see reason. But the suits at the office, they just saw numbers on a spreadsheet. They didn't see people. They just saw optimization and market value. Harrison felt the floor beneath him tilt. The world spinning in a slow, disorienting arc. The injustice wasn't just a general tragedy occurring in his city. It was a specific, calculated outcome of his own corporate policy. The realization was a heavy, suffocating mantle he was forced to wear. He wasn't just a witness to poverty. He was, through the reach of his own empire, the primary engine of it. Every skyscraper he had built was a monument to the displacement of women like Naomi. He had failed the very mission he had set for himself when he was a boy in that 1996 Honda. He turned and walked out of the diner, the neon light burning his eyes, knowing that he had to see what was behind the curtain of his own creation. The walk back to his car felt longer than the walk to the diner, each step heavily burdened by the weight of a 78-year-old man who had just confronted the horrifying reality that his entire life's work was anchored in a lie. Harrison sat in his Mercedes, the engine cold and silent, staring at the silver minivan. He didn't see a stranger's vehicle anymore. He saw a casualty of his own success. The irony was so sharp, so jagged, that it almost paralyzed him. He had spent decades believing his name stood for shelter, for stability, and for the preservation of the community, only to find it had become a synonym for displacement and corporate predation. The next morning, Harrison did not go to his usual country club or to the quiet park where he walked his dog. He drove directly to the steel and glass monolith that served as the headquarters of the Whitfield Development Group. He hadn't stepped foot in the building in over 2 years, preferring the distance and the sanitized reports of his semi-retirement. But he still held the master credentials to the company's internal servers. He bypassed the reception desk, his stature and the familiar shock of his white hair causing the security staff to defer to him as they always had, their faces masks of professional neutrality. He made his way to the sub-level archives, a windowless, climate-controlled room where the digital ghosts of the company were kept. For hours, he sat in the cold, flickering glow of the monitors, bypassing the sanitized, high-level summaries presented to the board. He dug deep into the raw data, the internal emails, and the project-specific relocation reports that had been hidden from his view. What he found was a systematic, clinical dismantling of the values he had once insisted were non-negotiable. He saw the Green Oaks project for what it truly was. A predatory shell game designed to extract maximum profit from the most vulnerable. The emails between the junior directors and the acquisitions team were chillingly casual, written with the flippant tone of people discussing inventory shrinkage in a warehouse. They discussed tenant turnover efficiency as if they were talking about replacing outdated light bulbs. There were memos detailing how to pressure elderly residents and single parents into leaving early, using bureaucratic intimidation and legal threats to avoid the costs of formal eviction processes. He found sprawling spreadsheets that reduced human lives to color-coded cells. Red for high-impact, easy exit, green for profit margin optimized. Naomi Jackson's file was there, buried in a folder marked Phase 2 Optimization. He saw notes in the margins of her rental history. Relocation assistance declined due to insufficient documentation. Process deemed complete. It was a lie, a bold, callous, and mathematically driven lie that had been signed off by a mid-level manager who had never set foot in the complex. Harrison felt a violent tremor in his hands. Not from the frailty of age, but from a righteous, burning fury that threatened to consume him. He saw his own name on the final approval documents, a digital signature that had been applied by the board without him ever seeing the actual plan. A convenient convenience he had afforded them years ago. They had used his reputation as a benevolent founder as a shield to deflect public criticism, even as they tore down the very communities he had sought to preserve. They had effectively weaponized his legacy against the people he had built it to protect. He realized then that the company had become a runaway train, stripped of its conscience. They viewed him as a relic, an old man who had outlived his relevance, while they carved up the city to feed a cycle of perpetual, soulless growth. He wasn't just observing a tragedy from a parking lot. He was the titular head of a machine that had been designed to eat people like Naomi Jackson for breakfast. He closed the files, his jaw set in a line of steel that hadn't been there for decades. He would not just be a witness to this destruction. He would be the hammer that broke it. He gathered the evidence, the emails, the forged documents, the cruel, dehumanizing calculations, and copied them to a private, encrypted drive. He didn't know yet how he would use it, only that the silence he had maintained for the sake of retirement had finally come to an end. The quiet, dignified woman in the Waffle House parking lot was going to change everything. And the board members currently celebrating their quarterly bonuses had no idea the storm that was about to break. He stood up, his legs feeling strong for the first time in years, and walked out into the bright, unforgiving light of the lobby, ready to reclaim the name that had been stolen from him. The quarterly shareholders meeting was designed to be the crowning achievement of corporate theater. Held in the grand, high-ceilinged ballroom of the Charlotte Convention Center, the room was packed with institutional investors, high-frequency traders, industry analysts, and the top-tier executives of the Whitfield Development Group. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, strong coffee, and the palpable, nervous anticipation of a record-breaking dividend announcement. It was a room where success was measured in decimals, and where human consequence was rarely invited to take a seat. The CEO, Marcus Thorne, a man Harrison had personally mentored and recruited over a decade ago, stood on the raised dais. He was in the middle of a polished, slide-heavy presentation about the unprecedented success of the Green Oaks redevelopment. His voice smooth, practiced, and utterly devoid of sincerity as he spoke of optimizing urban landscapes, increasing density, and improving community property values. He was painting a portrait of progress while the reality of the people he had displaced festered just a few miles away. Then, Harrison walked out from the side stage. The room, which had been buzzing with professional chatter and the clack of laptop keys, went silent so abruptly it felt as though the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the space. The sea of suits turned in unison, their expressions shifting from boredom to confusion, and finally, to something approaching dread as they recognized the man who had built the very podium Thorne now occupied. "You're not on the agenda, Harrison," Thorne said, his smile faltering. though he tried to maintain his composure for the cameras mounted in the back of the room. He stepped forward, signaling to the security detail standing by the curtains. Harrison didn't answer him. He walked straight to the podium, his presence carrying the weight of a man who had finally reclaimed his own history from the scavengers. He didn't use the prepared teleprompter, nor did he offer a handshake. He pulled a small, silver remote from his jacket pocket and clicked it. The massive, high-definition projection screens behind the board members flickered to life. They weren't displaying real estate yields, growth charts, or renderings of the new luxury high-rises. They were displaying internal emails. The screen showed a private thread between Thorne and his executive vice president, explicitly detailing the plan to falsify the relocation assistance records for the families at Green Oaks. Below that, he brought up a spreadsheet titled Efficiency Targets, which clearly demonstrated that the redevelopment was never about improvement. It was about the calculated extraction of profit through the forced, illegal removal of long-term tenants. The room erupted in a chaotic, deafening mixture of gasps, angry shouting, and the frenetic clicking of cameras as the information hit the press feeds in real time. For 30 years, I have been told this company was building homes, Harrison's voice boomed, amplified by the hall's acoustics, stripped of his usual gravelly softness and replaced by a ringing clarity. Instead, I find that we have been building a machine that harvests misery for quarterly growth. I founded this firm to provide a floor for families, not to pull the rug out from under them. Thorne moved to intercept him, his face flushed with a mixture of panic and raw, unadulterated ego. Harrison, this is madness. You're destroying the stock value. You're ruining everything we've worked for. Quote, Harrison looked at the man he had once considered his protégé, seeing for the first time only the cold, bottomless ambition that had allowed a mother to sleep in her SUV while they toasted their success. I'm not ruining anything, Marcus. I'm correcting a catastrophic mistake. A mistake that started with me giving men like you the power to treat human lives like lines on a ledger. I built this company, and I am the one who will dismantle it if it refuses to serve the people it was meant to house. He held up the encrypted drive, a tiny piece of metal that contained the end of an era. Every fraudulent document, every manipulated report, and every bonus check tied to the displacement of our neighbors is on this drive. It's already been sent to the SEC, the local press, and the State Housing Commission. The redevelopment project at Green Oaks is finished. All similar projects are frozen, effective immediately, and every executive who signed off on the turnover efficiency plan is terminated. Effective now. The board members were scrambling, phones in hand, their faces pale as they realized the depth of the exposure. Harrison stood tall, a patriarch finally putting his house in order. He had not only shredded the reputation of the executives who had betrayed his trust, he had effectively set fire to the corrupt structure of his own empire. As security hovered, uncertain of whether to intervene against the founder, Harrison didn't retreat. He stood his ground, watching the chaos unfold with a profound, terrifying sense of relief. For the first time in months, the weight in his chest had dissipated. He had spoken, and in doing so, he had signaled to the city that the era of silence was over. The empire was burning, and for the first time, he felt truly free. The aftermath of the shareholders' meeting was a whirlwind of legal filings, executive resignations, and public inquiries that dominated the headlines for weeks. As the dust began to settle, the corporate world looked on in disbelief, unable to comprehend why a man of Harrison's stature would willingly torch his own legacy. But for Harrison, the noise of the boardrooms and the panic of the stock market became secondary to the silence of the mission he had now fully embraced. He didn't just walk away from the wreckage he had inherited. He stayed to oversee the slow, painful process of dismantling the very systems that had allowed the displacement to occur. The restoration of the Green Oaks complex was not handled through the typical corporate channels that prioritized profit margins. Harrison established a standalone restoration fund, seeded with his own personal wealth and independent of the main company's fluctuating stock. He appointed a committee of community advocates, social workers, and former tenants, the very people his company had once viewed as statistics, to oversee the project. They weren't just fixing the buildings. They were ensuring the original families had a permanent, guaranteed path back home. Every door that had been locked to the community was reopened, and every lease was rewritten to ensure that the concept of affordable housing was not just a marketing slogan, but a reality. Months passed as the leaves of Charlotte turned from deep green to the crisp, vibrant gold of late autumn. On a Tuesday morning, the first phase of the restoration reached its long-awaited completion. Harrison sat in his car, parked quietly across the street from the complex. He didn't approach the gathering. He didn't want the spectacle of a billionaire's arrival to overshadow the return of the people who truly belonged there. He watched with a quiet, steady gaze as a familiar silver minivan pulled up to the curb. It was the same vehicle he had watched for 7 weeks in that cold, dark parking lot, but today, it looked different in the sunlight. He saw Naomi Jackson step out of the driver's seat. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that takes years to wash away. But for the first time since he had met her, the hard, defensive tension that usually tightened her shoulders had vanished. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, staring up at the newly renovated facade of the building that had once been snatched away from her. The children, Jordan, Ava, and Caleb, tumbled out of the car, their eyes wide and bright as they looked at their new home. They didn't see the history of the struggle. They only saw the promise of a room of their own. Naomi reached into her pocket and pulled out a set of keys. She didn't hurry. She walked to the main entrance with a slow, deliberate grace, holding the heavy door open for her children. Harrison watched as they disappeared inside, their laughter echoing briefly in the crisp air before the door clicked shut, signaling a final return to warmth, safety, and the kind of stability that no amount of money could ever really buy. It was a simple, mundane act, but to Harrison, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. He remained in his car for a long time after the street had gone quiet. He had spent his entire life obsessed with the height of his buildings, the span of his empire, and the endurance of his name on the city skyline. He had once believed that greatness was measured by how much space one could occupy. But as he looked at the quiet apartment building, he realized that he had finally understood the true, quiet purpose of his wealth. It wasn't meant to build monuments to his own success or to dwarf the city around it. It was meant to be a tool to protect the vulnerable, a means to provide a floor upon which others could stand. He started the engine, the low hum of the car the only sound in the peaceful morning. There would be more work to do, more projects to audit, more policies to rewrite, and a whole new corporate culture to nurture from the ashes of the old. But as he drove away from the curb, he felt a profound, aching lightness in his soul that he hadn't known in decades. The silver minivan was gone, parked safely in a garage where it no longer served as a home. Harrison Whitfield finally knew that his legacy wouldn't be found in the glass towers that grazed the clouds, but in the families who were finally able to sleep soundly and securely behind their own front doors. He wasn't a savior. He was a man who had finally paid a debt he had spent a lifetime avoiding. And as he pulled back into the rhythm of the city, he knew, for the first time in his 78 years, that he would finally be able to sleep. The city ahead of him was just a city, but the ground beneath him felt For the first time, like home.